Welcome to the Real News Network in Baltimore. I'm Kim Brown. And what is proving to be a landmark decision in Massachusetts, more than 20,000 drug convictions are set to be dismissed because of misconduct by a former crime lab chemist. Hundreds of convictions are expected to be vacated. So how does this jive with the harsh law and order rhetoric coming from the Trump administration about doubling down on the failed war on drugs and a return to federal policies of mass incarceration? Well, today we're joined with Carl Williams. Carl is an attorney with the ACLU of Massachusetts who has been an active player in working on this case. He is on the line today from Boston. Carl, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So first, let's start with the facts of this and how it centers around Annie Dukan, who is a chemist who was convicted in 2013 of 27 counts, including perjury, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. What was she accused of doing?
So she actually did a number of things. One, she did a thing called dry labbing, and that is instead of chemically testing in a process called GCMS, testing substances that were suspected to be drugs, what she did is she looked at it and said, well, this looks like it's packaged like heroin. It's probably heroin. This looks like cocaine. It's probably cocaine. That was one thing she did. She also added weight to drug samples. When something was maybe 98 grams and 100 grams might trigger a very severe mandatory minimum, she said, well, it would be better if it was 100 grams. I'm going to add some weight to that. So she added weight. She dry labbed. She also tainted evidence. That is, I always say, she put some of the salt and the pepper. She sometimes put cocaine into a sample and it tested positive for cocaine. She also lied about her resume. She said she had a master's degree. She didn't. She also, about all of these things, obviously never testified on the stand that she dry labbed, added weight, lied about her resume. So when she was on the stand testifying in drug cases, she was perjuring herself. So a number of these things were happening throughout her tenure for about 8 years.
Wow, that really puts me in the mindset of an old rap lyric by the Ghetto Boys from Willie D when he said he thought he had cane, but it was gold medal flour. I mean, you can't really eyeball drugs, especially in the context of a criminal action. So how was this misconduct initially discovered?
I want to go back to a previous point. I thought you were going to say I'd rather be tried by 12 than be carried by 6, but I digress.
Also a good Ghetto Boys lyric.
I just had to bring that in there. So I'm sorry, you had a real question and I diverted.
It's all right. So how was Annie's misconduct initially discovered? How did you even find out that she was not doing her job properly? She was referred to as a superwoman by her coworkers because of how fast she worked, according to the New York Times.
Right. Well, how fast she didn't she didn't test drugs, which, if I was not writing briefs or if I was not litigating cases, I could get them done really fast. So she there was a reshuffling of the state drug lab, and it was going to come under the administration of the state police. When that happened, a lot of things started coming forward that had been hidden.
So, Carl, exactly how many people were impacted by this, and how many people actually went to jail?
It's hard to know the number of exact people who went to jail. We do know that 24,000, just over 24,000 people had adverse dispositions. That means they were found guilty, they were put in jail, they got probation, they went to state prison, something of that happened. But if you say how many people were impacted, I mean, some people were deported from the country because of these cases. Some people lost their many people lost their licenses. Many people's mother, grandmother, father, brother, were kicked out of public housing because of these. People didn't get student loans. People couldn't get jobs. People couldn't get barber's licenses. So there are a lot of collateral consequences that these cases affected people's lives also. And I should say, of the 24,000 cases that Annie Dukan signed a certificate on, 60% of those cases were simple possession of drugs. So we're talking about people who just possessed drugs, not who sold them, not who distributed them, manufactured them, trafficked them, just possessed them. And 90% of these cases were cases that were heard in our lower courts. They're not the very, very serious drug cases. They're people who possess small amounts. They were charged with misdemeanors or lower level felonies. So when these district attorneys come and say, oh, these were the worst of the worst folks, these are dangerous criminals, the facts and the statistics belie that.
Yes, a spokesperson for the Suffolk County District Attorney was quoted in the New York Times as saying that these weren't wrongful convictions, that they could actually have been looked at again in the courts based off of procedural errors. So I know the ACLU of Massachusetts represented a number of people who are impacted by this. Could you give us an example, an anecdotal example of someone's life that was adversely impacted by this individual's misconduct?
Sure, I'll tell you a case of when I was a public defender, and not to give you super specifics to disturb a person's privacy, but I had clients that, someone who worked at a bank, right? She had a boyfriend who did and sold drugs. When he would get pulled over, he wasn't the nicest guy in the world. He would basically make her hold the drugs. Is that a good decision on her part? Probably not. But did she lose her job? Because when that case was being prosecuted against her, yes, she lost her job. Did she have trouble finding a job because she had an open case? Yes, she had trouble finding a job because she had an open case. Did she struggle with that for many years afterwards? Because this happened quite a long time ago. And is that something that affects her life in some ways until today? Yeah, it is. Is she one of the people whose case should have been dismissed, is going to be dismissed? Yes, she is. And the idea that talking about whether people are guilty or innocent or whether these are wrongful convictions, our Supreme Judicial Court called this, said these cases this was egregious government misconduct, right? So for district attorneys or district attorney spokespeople to say something different, this is egregious government misconduct. And I'll say, I learned something that it's not a law, but it's a rule. And I learned it in kindergarten. I think a lot of us learned it. You don't get to cheat and win. You don't get to play not by the rules and then, go home with a trophy, right? So the DAs are saying we should be able to keep these convictions, or, it's wrong to get rid of these convictions. But those convictions were based in fraudulent evidence. Those convictions, many of them were based in perjury. Those convictions were based in extreme government misconduct. And if they want to prosecute cases based on facts, based on real evidence, have at it. Have at it. We in this country are supposed to have due process. And if we have systems that subvert due process, you don't get to put people in jail on that. You don't get to put people on probation in that. You don't just get a do-over.
When we're looking from the outside in at Massachusetts, whom over the past several years seemingly has taken a number of steps to reform its drug laws and criminal justice reform. Massachusetts, I believe, was one of the early leaders of decriminalization of marijuana. It
Yes.
is now legal in the state. September of 2016, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court had a ruling in a case regarding a man named Jimmy Warren, which in effect said that black men are justified in running from the police because of long data that proves that black men are unfairly targeted and profiled by police. Is Massachusetts really taking a proactive way to sort of correct the wrongs and the mistakes of the criminal justice system and its drug policies?
I think I'm going to flip it on you a little bit. I think the people of Massachusetts are standing up and demanding justice, and we are winning victories in that. Right. So there's these people who are Dukin defendants who are organized, who are making statements about what's happening to them. There's a Facebook group, Victims of Annie Dukin. There are people who are talking about mandatory minimums. There are people who are challenging what has been the status quo, and that, problematic policing, prosecutors using mandatory minimums, drug laws that seemingly are much more deeply affecting, that much more are deeply affecting Black and brown folks. So those are things that activists, organizers, civil rights groups like the ACLU and our allies are working on and have been working on. And we've made some victories. And there still is a long way to go, I think.
So, against the backdrop of Annie Dukin and these 20,000 drug convictions that are expected to be dismissed, we have brand new Attorney General Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump as president basically doubling down on the failed war on drugs, pledging to restore things like federal mandatory minimums and increasing mass incarceration on a federal level. When we see how many tens of thousands of people's lives were impacted by the willful disregard of civil rights by this agent of the state, Ms. Dukin, versus the rhetoric that we're hearing coming from the Trump administration. What does that make you think about?
It makes me think there's a long fight ahead, but there was a long fight behind us, right? Because we as people of color, we as Black people in this country have historically always struggled for freedom, and we've always won, right? We as the ACLU for nearly the last 100 years has struggled for freedom, and we have many victories. This is just another one. It might be the biggest one in terms of criminal cases dismissed as a result of one case in history of the United States. I think, as far as we know, this is the largest dismissal of criminal cases based on one case filing in the history of the United States of America. So victories are happening. So to Jeff Sessions, I'd say, since we're quoting hip hop lyrics, hi hater, you see me. And we're going to fight. We're going to fight the federal government. We were in court in the last weeks of January. My boss, Matthew Siegel, the director of the ACLU of Massachusetts legal department, filed along with the American Immigration Lawyers Association to have an emergency stay against the United States government. We won that within hours of them saying they were going to have this Muslim ban. That was stopped for a week. Folks on the West Coast picked up the ball, some attorneys general and some ACLU affiliates, other attorneys working for justice, carried it along, and we knocked down the first ban. We knocked down the second ban. We're fighting to uphold the rule of law. We're fighting to uphold the tenets held in the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment, people's right to counsel and people's right to due process. And we're winning those things because the people of this country understand that some of the stated policies of the Attorney General and the stated policies of the President of the United States are not in line with civil liberties, human rights, and basic tenets of freedom.
We've been speaking with Carl Williams. He is an attorney with the ACLU of Massachusetts. He has been actively working on behalf of what they have called the Dukin defendants, tens of thousands of people who have been impacted by the actions of now convicted former chemist Annie Dukin, who was charged and convicted in 2013 of a number of offenses, including tampering with evidence. And this is a landmark case in which lots of people's lives will be impacted. So, Carl, we appreciate you joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Keep up the fight.
Thank you, and we appreciate you watching and supporting the Real News Network.